Liana Brooks didn't buy her father's land to make friends or decorate it for seasonal contests. She came for silence, distance, and permanence. Her decision to move back wasn't a romantic return to childhood. It was necessity wrapped in grit. The land wasn't much, a long, forgotten patch of overgrown brush and warped fencing at the edge of a semi-developed residential area that tried hard to call itself community. It had sat untouched since her father's passing 6 years earlier, and, while everyone expected the land to be quietly absorbed into one of the neighboring parcels, Liana surprised them all by showing up with a truck, a permit, and a plan. At 32, she was unshakably private, visibly composed, and worked in construction logistics, one of the few women in her field who commanded union teams without raising her voice. She didn't decorate her emails with exclamation marks, didn't linger in small talk, and had long ago abandoned the idea that anyone would fight her battles for her. So when she rolled onto that property in a rented diesel flatbed loaded with fencing supplies, soil pH kits, and weather-treated steel rail segments, the neighbors took notice, but stayed quiet. The perimeter of her land was marked by an ancient wooden fence, long since leaning and splitting from decades of neglect. She didn't tear it down right away. Instead, she worked inward, clearing brush, leveling the small patches of grayed uneven land, reinforcing the base of the old structure with something no one could see. Pre-drilled steel beams sunk 3 feet into the earth at measured intervals. The rails, nearly 100 pounds each, were surplus from a decommissioned track supply, perfect for structural load-bearing and invisible security. They weren't decorative, and they weren't meant to intimidate. They were there for stability. Her father had once lost a tractor to a sinkhole on that very slope, and she didn't intend to let history repeat. She didn't mention the reinforcements to anyone. The community she had moved into, mostly retirees and white-collar midlifers with digital jobs and solar panels, had formed a close-knit but insular residential board that treated neighborhood decisions like statecraft. Liana wasn't part of it. She had never applied, never received a welcome letter, and didn't return the first 3 calls from the self-appointed president, a woman named Karen West, whose husband had made his money in commercial insurance and whose power came from precisely understanding which rules most people didn't bother to read. Karen had seen Liana as a problem the moment she arrived, not because of what she did, but because of what she didn't do. She didn't participate, didn't consult, didn't ask permission. She worked all day behind temporary construction screens, didn't water her lawn the way others did, and didn't wave back from her driveway. By the 3rd week, Karen had already filed a noise concern over early morning soil delivery. When it was dismissed, she escalated to claiming Liana was creating an industrial site in a residential zone. This, too, failed. Liana didn't react publicly. She never raised her voice or fired back at neighborhood Facebook groups. What she did instead was double down. She installed blackout tint on her windows, switched her outdoor lighting to motion-activated security flood lamps, and brought in surveyors to recertify her property lines with military-grade GPS mapping. It was a move that said, "I am not here to ask. I am here to stay." What Liana didn't expect was the frequency of incidents that followed. Her mailbox was knocked down twice in 1 month. Packages were left damaged or opened, then resealed. One morning, she found someone had left a pamphlet about voluntary property integration tucked into her storm door, unsigned but freshly printed. She had it fingerprinted and documented. Still, she said nothing. When the crash happened, it wasn't at night, nor was it subtle. It was 4:17 p.m. on a Saturday, just after a rain spell had made the slope of the road slick and treacherous. Liana had just stepped out of her small tool shed, carrying an oil-stained bag from a broken chainsaw engine. The sound of the impact was deep and wet, like a full dumpster thrown off a loading dock. She dropped the bag instinctively and ran towards the front gate. What she saw stopped her breath short. A silver Lexus GX had plowed into the corner of her reinforced fence, the wood obliterated on the surface, but the steel skeleton behind it had held firm. The vehicle's hood was crumpled like foil, front bumper torn clean off, airbags deployed inside the cab. The driver's door creaked open and Karen West stumbled out, dazed, hair disheveled, one heel broken. Her eyes locked with Liana's, and something shifted, shock, followed quickly by rage. "You," Karen gasped, pulling herself upright, "you put steel in that fence. That's illegal. That's entrapment." Liana said nothing at first. Her gaze moved to the damage. The rail had held up. Her surveyor's stake was still visible, inches away from the point of impact, well within her boundary. She stepped forward calmly, voice steady. "You hit my property." "You booby-trapped it," Karen snapped, voice rising. "I'll sue. You're endangering residents." "I was turning around." "You don't turn around by accelerating into a fence." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands trembled. A neighbor came running with a phone, having heard the crash. Sirens echoed from the distance, but Karen had already regained her composure. Not as a victim, but as someone taking mental inventory of every angle for retaliation. "You're going to regret this," she said. Liana didn't respond. She looked back at the metal rail, now smeared with streaks of silver paint and fine cracks in the wood that had absorbed the impact. She could already feel what was coming. Not just claims or citations, but a slow, methodical effort to isolate, pressure, and discredit her. Karen wouldn't attack all at once. She'd chip away, file complaints, involve zoning, insurance, bylaws, and Liana would not retreat. Not from land her father left her. Not from a system designed to wear people down until they complied. She went back to the tool shed. There was a camera inside. A mounted unit, powered separately, pointed at the fence. She hadn't needed it until now, but she had it. And she'd keep it rolling. Because the crash wasn't the end. It was only the signal that the real conflict had begun. The following days unfolded with surgical precision, as though Karen had been preparing for this moment long before her Lexus ever touched the rail. While the physical crash could be blamed on slick pavement and poor judgment, what came after left little to coincidence. The very next morning, Liana found a printed notice taped to her mailbox, encased in a transparent sleeve and stamped with a red insignia that read, "Community Standards Enforcement Advisory." It wasn't an official municipal document. It bore no county seals, no legal referencing, but it carried the carefully calibrated language of authority. "Your property has been flagged for non-standard perimeter enhancements," it began. "Immediate evaluation required. Potential code violations may result in administrative penalties." The document was unsigned. No contact number, no issuing agent. Just a generic email and a web link to a private domain ending in .org. Liana didn't take the bait. Instead, she scanned the document into a PDF, logged the time and location of discovery, then sent it to her attorney. After the crash, she'd retained a civil defense lawyer, not out of paranoia, but from pragmatism. She had seen these types before. People who dressed their aggression in procedure and layered harassment beneath the pretense of collective interest. She wasn't going to be caught without a legal buffer, but that didn't stop Karen from escalating. By Tuesday, a man claiming to be a district safety liaison showed up at the edge of her property, dressed in plain khakis and carrying a clipboard. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer identification, just started taking photographs of her fence from the sidewalk. When Liana approached and calmly requested to see his credentials, he shifted his stance awkwardly and muttered, "I'm just here on behalf of the neighborhood council." She didn't raise her voice. "Yo." Instead, she pulled out her phone, photographed him, and said, "Then you'll have no problem identifying yourself." He left without further words. Later, her lawyer confirmed no such liaison existed on record. That night, the boundary between civic order and coordinated targeting blurred. Liana returned from a late shift to find 3 orange utility flags planted in her front yard, marking underground lines that no one had requested service for. Alongside them, a wooden stake with red tape was hammered into the ground just inches from her survey marker. This wasn't confusion. It was a message. Someone was trying to imply boundary disputes without actually saying it aloud, which would trigger legal claims and liability. Liana didn't touch the flags. Instead, she filed a digital FOIA request with the County Utilities Coordination Office to identify who had submitted the line marking request. The response took 48 hours. The ticket had come from a contractor named D. Leach Services, subcontracted out of a neighboring county with no digital footprint and a disconnected phone number. When her attorney dug further, they learned that D. Leach wasn't a registered LLC, at least not in that state. In effect, someone had created a ghost company to fabricate utility activity on her land. Meanwhile, Karen kept up appearances. She hosted a block meeting, which Liana declined to attend, and was later told by one of the more neutral neighbors that her name had come up. Karen allegedly expressed concern about hostile behavior, referencing the crash in vague terms, describing it as a wake-up call for us all to ensure our neighborhood doesn't descend into unsafe, adversarial spaces. It was political language, insidious and nonspecific, crafted to evoke unease without saying anything actionable. Then came the citation. Hand-delivered by a courier, it stated that Liana's fence had violated regional visibility standards for corner lots. This was patently false. Her property was nowhere near an intersection, nor did her fence obstruct any public line of sight. But the complaint had been registered with the county's minor infraction office, which meant she had to respond. Her lawyer filed the rebuttal immediately and demanded a hearing. What stood out wasn't the merit of the claim, it had none, but the sophistication of the attack. It wasn't amateur harassment. It was professional, procedural, deliberately scattered across administrative channels so that each blow felt like paperwork rather than persecution. Each issue, in isolation, looked minor. But collectively, they amounted to siege warfare. The goal wasn't to win in court. The goal was to exhaust her. At this point, Liana decided to formalize her defense posture. She expanded her legal team, bringing in a land use consultant and a private zoning analyst. She registered for automatic alerts on her parcel in the county clerk's database, ensuring she'd be notified of any changes or inquiries on her property within hours. She installed encrypted backup storage for her surveillance footage and subscribed to a third-party monitoring service that would flag any abnormal patterns in traffic or visual anomalies captured by her cameras. And still, it wasn't enough to slow Karen down. Late Thursday evening, a municipal inspector, this time legitimate, arrived unannounced. His badge checked out. His clipboard bore the city's seal. He was there to follow up on anonymous safety concerns related to the structural integrity of Liana's perimeter fencing. When Liana calmly asked whether he had a probable cause or visible evidence, he hesitated, then conceded he didn't. She allowed him to photograph from the sidewalk, recorded the interaction, and documented his departure. The next morning, she found a printed notice, unsigned again, posted to her driveway with duct tape. It had one sentence, printed in 60-point font. Non-compliant fencing zone. Action required. She didn't remove it. She had it professionally laminated and mounted to a display board inside her home, under a printed title, The Campaign. Because that's what it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not a clash of personalities. It was a deliberate campaign orchestrated by someone who had the time, resources, and inclination to weaponize the gray areas of civil code. That weekend, her lawyer called with a warning. "We've received unofficial word that Karen has retained counsel. You're going to see a shift from soft pressure to legal maneuvering." When Liana asked what she should expect next, the answer came without hesitation. "They'll probably try to devalue your property, claim you've created an unsafe condition. If they can't scare you out, they'll try to make you financially bleed out." By Monday, her insurance provider reached out. A risk assessment had been triggered via third-party review. They were launching a site inspection within the month to determine if her fence's foundation posed a liability hazard. When Liana asked who initiated the review, she was told the report had come from a regional database aggregate, compiled through community concern logs. There was no author listed. It was then she realized the scope had changed. Karen wasn't just trying to punish her for the accident. She was trying to push her off the land altogether. The crash had been the spark. This was the fire. By the time the first of the formal hearing notices arrived, Liana had already begun living as if every detail of her day would be admissible in court. She no longer treated these attacks as isolated frustrations, but as part of a structured and unrelenting effort to unseat her from her own property, and that mindset changed how she responded to every new attempt. She documented conversations with her own contractors, recorded timestamps for even the smallest deliveries, and kept a real-time log of every incident, no matter how trivial. The enemy, she realized, wasn't acting randomly. They were building a case, one that would be crafted from layers of manufactured concerns, carefully staged appearances of community discomfort, and targeted bureaucratic sniping. Karen had found the perfect formula: use the language of policy to orchestrate a personal war. The letter itself came via certified mail, marked as Notice of Structural Review Hearing, Zoning Compliance Inquiry. It accused Liana of violating several obscure provisions related to fencing material integrity and unpermitted modifications, exceeding accepted subterranean depth. That last phrase told Liana everything she needed to know. Someone had discovered the steel reinforcement under her fence, and they intended to weaponize it. Not through a criminal angle. They couldn't argue sabotage, but through zoning statutes designed for far less insidious infractions. The hearing was set for 10 days later. Until then, her property was placed under what they called provisional compliance scrutiny, which allowed random walk-by inspections and suspended her right to make any further modifications, even minor ones like trimming hedges or painting the fence. It was a clever maneuver. Karen had found a legal pretext to freeze her. That week, the pressure multiplied. Her mailbox was tagged with a printed sticker listing a series of pending violations. Trash collection skipped her address entirely for 3 consecutive pickups. Her local postal delivery changed without explanation, and the new courier seemed to mysteriously lose or misplace anything not directly handed to her. Even her dog, a well-trained shepherd mix, began to react to nightly disturbances. Soft tapping on the side of the house, distant flashing lights caught only in the periphery of her security system, and vehicles that parked just out of camera range and remained idling for uncomfortable stretches. Still, Liana did not lash out publicly. She did what Karen never expected. She adapted. She filed formal noise disturbance reports for the suspicious vehicle activity. She collected footage, worked with her lawyer to submit notarized requests for delivery investigations, and filed a preliminary claim of harassment under local civil statutes. And she began to speak quietly with the only people who knew what this kind of pressure looked like. Others who had quietly fought and lost against neighborhood power structures, those who had sold their homes for peace or burned themselves out, trying to win without understanding that the other side wasn't playing fair. What they told her confirmed her suspicions. Karen had done this before, just never with anyone who resisted long enough to leave a paper trail. 3 years prior, a couple 2 blocks over had put in a low retaining wall to manage runoff. Within months, they were buried in violations and untraceable community complaints until their insurer dropped them. Unable to refinance, they sold under market. That lot now belonged to Karen's cousin. That same week, Liana's property appraiser received a call, anonymous of course, challenging the lot's environmental status. The caller claimed Liana's underground railings could be causing soil destabilization that would compromise nearby homes in case of seismic shifts. The claim was absurd. Her railings had stabilized the hill, but the appraiser now had a formal obligation to inspect, meaning Liana had to suspend all other activities on her land until the inquiry was complete. And that's when she realized something even darker. This wasn't just about her fence, or even the crash. Karen wasn't simply angry. She had a larger plan. A redevelopment map Liana had seen weeks earlier suddenly made sense. The county had begun reviewing a rezoning petition for low-density reconfiguration of the residential belt that included Liana's property. If passed, it would allow for the demolition of older structures and introduction of modern condos, profitable, compact, and ideal for vertical development. Karen and those behind her needed Liana gone not because she was inconvenient, but because she was in the way. Knowing this, Liana recalibrated her strategy. She began working with an urban land use specialist from the neighboring county who wasn't afraid to testify against local zoning boards. She hired a digital forensics consultant to cross-reference metadata from Karen's anonymous notices with document versions found on public neighborhood servers. And quietly, she filed for public records access on Karen's financial disclosures, checking for any undisclosed interests in nearby development firms. She didn't handle any of it alone. Every step was coordinated through her legal team, every move routed through official channels. She made no social media posts, gave no neighborhood statements, and answered no baiting emails. She became invisible and professionally dangerous. Karen responded in kind. During the next community meeting, to which Liana sent only her counsel as a proxy, Karen introduced a new proposed guideline package, an emergency policy restructuring, she called it, meant to streamline property enforcement in the interest of safety and uniformity. The proposal included language that would strip owners under active code review of their voting privileges in community matters. It was clearly aimed at Liana, though her name was never mentioned. But that wasn't all. The following morning, a set of laminated flyers appeared on public notice boards throughout the area. Each one showed an edited image of Liana's fence, rendered to look rusted, hazardous, and spiked, beneath a red header that read, "Would you let your kids walk by this?" There was no listed author, but the formatting matched earlier, unofficial, correspondence Karen had denied responsibility for. It was propaganda, and it was effective. By the end of the week, neighbors who used to offer neutral smiles began crossing the street to avoid her. A local child care group revoked their permission to use a nearby park, citing unresolved perimeter concerns in adjacent lots. Even her deliveries from national services arrived damaged, misrouted, or delayed. Some drivers wouldn't approach her gate. Despite all of this, Liana maintained her routine. She woke at the same hour, tended to her land, reviewed documents, sent and received legal communications, and kept her defense apparatus humming quietly but steadily. Her lawyer began preparing a countersuit, not just in defense of the fence, but under the grounds of orchestrated defamation, insurance manipulation, and zoning harassment. And yet the tension only grew. When the inspection hearing finally arrived, it wasn't held in a courtroom. It was in a county review office, sterile and windowless, where 3 officials sat behind a folding table with neutral expressions and all the warmth of auditors. Karen wasn't present, but her influence was. The language used by the reviewers was clipped, administrative, and deliberately opaque. They mentioned perimeter irregularities, subterranean anomalies, and unusual land development patterns inconsistent with community topography. Liana's legal team delivered their response in layers: legal permits, engineering assessments, expert statements on soil stability, maps, and certified photographs. Every angle Karen had tried to exploit was met with overwhelming documentation. There were no outbursts, no righteous speeches. Just cold, procedural evidence. Her team dismantled the foundation of every complaint brick by brick. When the lead reviewer asked whether the steel reinforcements were intended to cause harm, Liana responded clearly. "They are foundational supports on my private property, placed for structural safety and disclosed within standard land improvement codes. If someone collides with them while trespassing or while driving off the public road, that's not a structural issue. That's operator failure." There was no immediate decision that day. It would take a week, but Liana left the building knowing the tide was shifting. Karen had fired every administrative bullet she had, and Liana had survived. But she also knew people like Karen didn't stop when they failed. They evolved, they regrouped, and they struck again. The week that followed the zoning review hearing moved with deceptive quiet, the kind of silence that hums with unseen momentum beneath the surface. Liana didn't take the calm as a victory. She knew better. Karen's brand of warfare wasn't won or lost in a single room or with a single decision. It was attritional, designed to stretch over months until her target either broke financially or gave up out of sheer exhaustion. What Liana didn't expect, however, was that the next strike would come from a direction even her team hadn't anticipated: through insurance. It began subtly. A letter from her home insurance provider stating that a third-party property assessment had flagged potential liability exposures related to her perimeter infrastructure. The company had initiated a risk reevaluation, and, pending its outcome, her current policy was being downgraded to conditional status. This meant that any future claims would be reviewed not only for merit, but also for structural legitimacy, essentially turning her protection into a formality. When she contacted the insurer, they were polite but firm. The review came from a regional data pool sourced from aggregated safety complaints. They could not, they said, trace it to a single party. But Liana already knew who was behind it. While her lawyer began drafting a formal challenge and petition for reinstatement of full coverage, Liana turned her attention to the strange digital footprint left behind by the notice. The forensics consultant she had hired weeks earlier managed to recover metadata from the letter's attached digital report, revealing that the file had originated from a private account associated with a local firm specializing in urban redevelopment. The same firm, her land use analyst confirmed, had recently submitted a proposal for a new residential complex, one that would directly benefit from rezoning the surrounding lots, including Liana's. This was no longer about Karen's personal vendetta. It was a coordinated, financially motivated pressure campaign with multiple participants, using regulatory frameworks to push out resistant landowners. Her property, once dismissed as old farmland, had now become a strategic keystone in a lucrative suburban transformation project. And someone, whether Karen or someone above her, had made Liana's compliance a condition of progress. Knowing this, Liana adjusted her posture again. She requested a meeting with the state-level zoning ombudsman, presented her compiled documents, and requested protection under municipal anti-harassment statutes designed for exactly this kind of coercion. The response was measured but sympathetic. The ombudsman acknowledged the pattern and initiated a preliminary review, not just of her case but of all zoning complaints filed from her subdivision over the past 5 years. If patterns of abuse could be identified, enforcement action would follow. It was a crack, small but growing, in the wall of immunity Karen and her associates had been operating behind. And as word of the investigation trickled back through official and unofficial channels, the tone of neighborhood pressure shifted. For the first time since the crash, Liana noticed hesitation. Contractors who had previously refused to work with her were now calling back, some quietly offering off-the-record assistance or apologizing for their earlier silence. One vendor admitted that he had received an anonymous email warning him to avoid association with the Brooks property, but now wanted to clear his name in case legal heat came down. Still, Karen wasn't finished. If she could no longer isolate Liana through policy, she would do it through fear. Late one evening, Liana returned home to find her fence had been partially defaced, not with graffiti, but with precise tool markings, as if someone had tried to saw through the outer paneling. It wasn't vandalism. It was a test. Someone wanted to measure the response time, to see if there was security patrol, camera delay, or police involvement. When Liana checked the footage, she found it tampered with. Not erased, just looped. Her surveillance system had been briefly overridden and tricked into replaying previous night footage while the actual breach took place. It was the kind of move that sent a message. We can get close when we want to. She didn't report it to the local precinct. She escalated straight to the district attorney's office with the help of her legal team. Within 48 hours, a digital crime investigator was dispatched and the system was seized for analysis. While it meant going blind for a few days, the potential evidence, especially the tampering itself, could trigger criminal proceedings if a link to Karen's network could be established. Liana wasn't just defending anymore. She was setting traps. And then the most unexpected twist arrived. One of Karen's own board members, a man named Harold Flynn, who had previously maintained polite distance from the conflict, requested a private conversation. He wasn't offering friendship. He made that clear. But he was tired of being involved in a power dynamic that was spiraling out of control. In a quiet meeting at a cafe outside the district, he told Liana that Karen had been circulating internal emails labeling her a destabilizing property owner, and had shared photos of her reinforced fence as examples of aggressive infrastructure. But more disturbingly, Harold had been asked to approve funds for a security services consultation that didn't go through any formal bidding process. Liana asked one question. Was it a contractor or a private security firm? Harold didn't answer directly, but he slid an envelope across the table with a logo she didn't recognize but her lawyer later identified. Civic Management Solutions, a private enforcement firm with a reputation for operating in legal gray zones under the banner of neighborhood compliance and real estate asset stabilization. That changed everything. The involvement of a private firm meant that Karen wasn't just pushing policies, she was actively outsourcing intimidation under the cover of safety enhancement. It also meant liability. If Liana could prove that unauthorized surveillance or tampering had been contracted through Civic Management Solutions, she wouldn't just have a civil case. She'd have grounds for criminal conspiracy and possibly damages. But the most sobering part of Harold's confession came last. He leaned forward and said quietly, "She's not acting alone anymore. There's developer money in play. Ooh, this is bigger than you. Or her." Liana left the meeting knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be simple, and that the crash had never been about a fence. It had been a probe, a test of resistance. Her steel-reinforced barrier hadn't just held back a vehicle, it had interrupted a timeline, delayed a land grab that had already been calculated and priced. She was the obstacle. And now, she had stepped into a fight with players far more invested than just one bitter suburban queen. But the one thing none of them counted on was that Liana wasn't afraid to be the obstacle. She knew how to stand in the way, and now she had the paper trail to do it legally. Liana had always understood pressure, logistical setbacks, supply chain disruptions, internal politics on multi-million-dollar construction projects. But nothing in her professional life had trained her for the kind of creeping, calculated warfare she now found herself navigating. What began as an isolated property dispute had transformed into a coordinated assault not only on her rights as a landowner, but on her psychological endurance. The campaign against her no longer operated under a veil of community concern or neighborhood regulation. It had mutated into a systemic offensive with elements of surveillance, sabotage, and corporate maneuvering. The mask of formality had slipped. What stood before her now was naked force, legally shaped but ruthlessly applied. Within days of the meeting with Harold Flynn, a noticeable shift occurred in the way her property was treated by city infrastructure. Her trash pickup was rerouted again without notification, leading to rotting refuse on the curb that code enforcement flagged as a violation. Water pressure inside her home dropped inexplicably, and a technician dispatched to inspect the system found that a control valve near the curb had been manually tampered with, the casing visibly disturbed and the locking mechanism cracked. When Liana demanded a report, the technician took photos but declined to submit any formal conclusion, muttering something about not wanting to get involved. The implication was clear. People were being warned off. Even deliveries were no longer safe. A landscaping material supplier refused to unload gravel at her property line, claiming client complications made the drop a liability. Liana switched vendors, but the new company's truck was held up at a weigh station for a surprise agriculture compliance inspection on a route that had never previously required it. Her order arrived 2 days late and was short by nearly 20%. When she followed up, the representative shrugged and offered a partial refund, citing paperwork that no longer existed. None of it was random. The real blow came through her financing. Her mortgage lender contacted her about an unexpected recalculation of her property's risk classification. Due to recent infrastructure and zoning irregularities, they explained, her property had been reclassified into a higher insurance bracket, thereby triggering a conditional review of her loan's terms. It was legal, buried deep within the covenants of her mortgage, and designed for use in situations like floodplain reclassification or fire zone redefinitions, not manufactured neighborhood skirmishes. But Karen and her allies had found a way to abuse it. The reclassification placed her in a new insurance tier, one that required a minimum policy coverage that her downgraded plan could no longer provide. She was now in breach of financing conditions through no fault of her own. Her attorney acted immediately, issuing a formal challenge to the reclassification with supporting documentation from independent appraisers, environmental analysts, and property law consultants. But the damage was done. The bank froze her lines of credit, placing a temporary hold on her ability to draw funds for land improvement. The freeze meant delayed payments, paused projects, and penalties. Contractors she'd managed to re-engage were now wary again, and one terminated their agreement altogether. Even her legal defense began to feel the pressure. Subpoena requests for internal communications between Karen and Civic Management Solutions were delayed repeatedly. The digital forensics expert assigned to her camera breach filed a report noting indirect interference with the system's root logs, language that strongly hinted at high-level manipulation, possibly even internal access granted under false pretenses. Still, the district attorney's office had yet to move forward with a criminal complaint. The bureaucratic wall she was fighting grew thicker, more opaque. Then someone broke into her utility shed. It wasn't a smash and grab. Nothing valuable was taken. But the organization of tools had been disturbed. Blueprints left open and smeared, a single metal pipe placed deliberately across the threshold of the door as though to make a point. It was psychological, intimate, a message that she was visible, accessible, and alone. That night, Liana didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because her mind wouldn't stop parsing through the implications of what was being done to her. Every form of infrastructure she relied on, waste removal, utilities, delivery, financial stability, was being chipped away. Not completely destroyed, but eroded, undermined, like a termite infestation, invisible until the beams collapsed. She convened her team the next morning, her lawyer, zoning specialist, land use consultant, and digital forensics analyst, on a secured video call routed through encrypted servers. No one sugar-coated the situation. The targeting was sophisticated, likely backed by both personal animus and corporate interest. Karen was no longer the face of the threat. She was a conduit. Behind her were players with development contracts to secure, properties to flip, and a timeline to protect. And Liana's resistance had disrupted that timeline. There was only one viable path forward now: go public. Not through media. She didn't want headlines or sympathy pieces. She needed institutional attention, governmental oversight, independent regulatory review, real investigative muscle. The land use consultant suggested contacting the State Attorney General's Real Estate Fraud Division. Her lawyer agreed and began drafting a complaint backed by every document, timestamp, photograph, and affidavit Liana had collected. The complaint was massive, nearly 200 pages of evidence, analysis, and corroborated testimony. It named Civic Management Solutions, implicated members of the community board, and described a pattern of organized coercion against multiple property owners. The package was submitted electronically and via certified mail within 72 hours. But Liana wasn't done. While the legal process churned, she initiated direct inquiries with the Federal Trade Commission on the misuse of property data, the Postal Inspection Service regarding mail interference, and even the state's Public Utilities Commission concerning tampering with service lines. Each agency had jurisdiction over a sliver of the harassment. None could solve the whole puzzle, but the flood of complaints from a single address made waves. Regulators don't like patterns they didn't identify first, and Liana was now forcing them to look. The retaliation was swift. A week after her filings, she received a formal notice of lien placement from the local Code Enforcement Bureau. The lien alleged unpaid penalties for fencing violations, dating back 6 months and totaling nearly $14,000. The amount was fabricated, based on citations that had either been dismissed or never issued. But the lien was real, recorded against her title. Clearing it would require legal proceedings or full payment under protest, neither of which could happen instantly. And until the lien was resolved, she couldn't refinance, couldn't sell, and couldn't modify her mortgage structure. She was boxed in. That was when her attorney made the call. It was time to file for injunctive relief. They prepared an emergency motion requesting court-ordered suspension of all enforcement actions against her property pending investigation into procedural misconduct. The motion argued that coordinated abuse of administrative channels had created a condition of undue hardship, and that continued action by city and neighborhood entities constituted harassment under civil rights statutes. It was a long shot. Courts don't like to intervene in local matters unless clear constitutional violations are demonstrated. But Liana had the advantage of overwhelming documentation and a growing chorus of third-party experts willing to testify. While the motion awaited review, Liana doubled her security. Not just cameras, but structural reinforcements. She hired an independent contractor, recommended by her zoning analyst, to install tamper alarms on her utility lines and fence access points. She outfitted her shed with biometric locks and installed concealed perimeter sensors that triggered silent alerts. She wasn't preparing for war. She was acknowledging that one was already in progress. The final blow of the second escalation came not through paperwork or sabotage, but through the court of public perception. An anonymous video surfaced online, edited with dramatic music and inflammatory captions, showing Liana confronting the supposed district safety liaison from weeks earlier. The clip was cropped to exclude her calm request for identification, and instead portrayed her as an aggressive, threatening figure challenging a public servant. The video spread through local community channels, fueled by coordinated reposts and comment bots. It didn't go viral, but it reached the right audience, those predisposed to distrust outsiders, to interpret assertiveness as hostility. But this time, Liana was ready. She traced the origin of the post through digital watermarking embedded in the file, something her forensic analyst had quietly started embedding in all her surveillance output weeks earlier. The metadata linked back to a private account associated with Civic Management Solutions. It was the final thread. With that connection verified, her attorney expanded the fraud complaint into a formal conspiracy case. The name Karen West was no longer alone on the header. It now shared space with executives, subcontractors, and private enforcement consultants. And as Liana read through the final draft, reviewing line after line of allegations turned evidence, she felt something unfamiliar rise through her exhaustion. Not relief, not pride, conviction. They had tried everything. And she was still standing. When the court date for the emergency motion was finally confirmed, Liana knew she had entered the final corridor of the battle. There was no illusion left, no ambiguity about what she was facing. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute or even an attempt to enforce arbitrary standards. It was an engineered, multi-tiered effort to dispossess her under the guise of community management, and it was now being dragged into the light. The motion hearing would determine whether all enforcement actions, liens, inspections, and procedural complaints against her property would be halted under judicial protection while the broader investigation unfolded. If it was granted, Karen and her collaborators would lose the power of leverage. The procedural avalanche they had so meticulously constructed would freeze in mid-air, suspended by court order, and it would mean the public narrative would begin to shift. The courtroom was unremarkable. Beige walls, a judge in plain robes, no reporters, no cameras. Just a handful of legal teams, stiff folders and strained expressions. Liana sat at the defense table with her attorney, who spoke in clear, grounded tones, never once raising his voice. He began not with drama, but with structure, laying out the pattern of complaints, the timeline of infractions, the sequence of denials and reversals. Each point was substantiated. He referenced over 70 exhibits, from photos to affidavits, service reports to expert analyses. He didn't paint Liana as a victim. He showed her as a citizen who had exhausted every normal recourse and been forced into court not to win sympathy, but to stop what could no longer be handled through the channels that had failed her. Opposing counsel, representing the city, the community board, and indirectly Karen's influence, tried to reframe the issue as a matter of misunderstanding and neighborhood cohesion. They insisted that the complaints were not coordinated but emergent, a byproduct of Liana's failure to integrate into the cooperative fabric of the neighborhood. The term was telling. The judge raised an eyebrow at that phrasing and asked for clarification, prompting a flurry of papers as the opposition tried to walk back the implication that conformity was being enforced through punitive action. Then came the footage. Liana's attorney presented a cut of video files from the tampered surveillance system, stitched with forensic timestamps proving the footage had been altered remotely. The expert testimony confirmed the system override originated from a known IP address associated with Civic Management Solutions. When asked whether the footage had been publicly released, Liana's team confirmed it had been uploaded online, deliberately edited to distort context, and traced back through metadata to the same corporate account. At that point, the judge leaned back in his chair, asked for a 10-minute recess, and then returned with a firm tone. The motion was granted in full. Effective immediately, all liens, inspections, administrative complaints, and procedural reviews were to be suspended. No further enforcement actions could be taken until the outcome of the ongoing investigation into misconduct and coordinated harassment was resolved. Furthermore, the judge ordered that Civic Management Solutions be subject to subpoena for all documentation and communication related to their engagement with the community board. It was the single largest shift in the battle since it began. The psychological shift was immediate. Within 48 hours, Liana's mailbox was no longer filled with unsigned threats or citations. The trash service resumed, the postal deliveries normalized, and the neighbor who had once avoided eye contact suddenly offered a half-hearted wave across the driveway. Karen, conspicuously absent from public view, made no statements, but whispers spread. About the court order, about the investigation, about the firm being under review. For the first time, Liana wasn't being framed as the outsider or the problem. She was becoming something else. The person who wouldn't fold, the one who pulled back the curtain. But the conflict wasn't over. What came next wasn't retaliation. It was collapse. One by one, the scaffolding Karen had built to support her narrative began to fail. Harold Flynn, perhaps seeing where the tide was heading, formally resigned from the board and submitted a deposition acknowledging the misuse of procedural powers. A junior employee at Civic Management Solutions turned whistleblower, handing over internal memos that revealed targeted pressure strategies against multiple homeowners in other neighborhoods. The city began auditing zoning decisions in areas flagged in Liana's complaint, and a separate civil lawsuit was filed by another resident, previously silent, who now claimed similar harassment after refusing to sell their lot. Then came the subpoenaed documents. When Liana's legal team received the first batch from Civic Management Solutions, what they found confirmed everything they'd feared and more. There were invoices for community stabilization assessments, billed directly to the neighborhood's administrative fund, internal memos tracking non-compliant owners, and most damningly, an email exchange between Karen and a representative from a development consortium discussing expected parcel acquisition rates, with a map that included Liana's property outlined in red. The smoking gun wasn't flashy, but it was irrefutable. Karen had been operating not as a concerned resident, but as an embedded stakeholder in a redevelopment scheme, one that relied on displacing owners through procedural exhaustion rather than direct purchase. Her leadership on the community board gave her access to compliance channels. Her alliance with Civic Management Solutions gave her teeth, and her partnership with developers gave her motive. Once the documents were filed into the court record, the narrative publicly shifted. The City Council launched its own internal ethics probe, Civic Management Solutions suspended all operations in the district, and Karen West was formally removed from her board position pending review. Liana didn't attend the hearing for that removal. She had no interest in watching her opponent fall. She was already focused on the next stage: repair, reconstruction, and reclamation. But that didn't mean she walked away untouched. The toll had been heavy, financially, emotionally, professionally. Her credit had taken hits from the insurance downgrades and mortgage reclassification. Her land, though now stabilized, had become infamous. Her name a quiet synonym for trouble in certain circles. But she had also become something else: respected, feared, and, more importantly, studied. Other property owners reached out to her privately, asking for advice, wanting to know how to begin their own fights. Lawyers requested copies of her case files for training. Even regulatory staff referenced her filings in internal memos. She had become precedent. And in the final weeks of the court proceedings, as the case transitioned from emergency motions to formal accountability lawsuits, Liana did something that surprised everyone, even her lawyer. She filed a countersuit, not just against Karen West, but against the entire board, Civic Management Solutions, and the real estate consortium whose plans had relied on her silence. The lawsuit demanded damages not only for financial loss and reputational harm, but for systemic abuse of public processes. It framed the events not as isolated misconduct, but as evidence of a growing trend, using community management structures as levers for private real estate acquisition. The suit made news, and for the first time, Liana didn't stay silent. She gave a single interview. Not emotional, not personal, just facts, process. systemic failure, structural reform. She didn't tell her story to be pitied. She told it so that the next person in her position wouldn't feel like they were insane for standing their ground. Because if someone crashes into your fence, the problem isn't always the damage. Sometimes it's the people lining up behind the wheel, ready to finish what they started if the first hit doesn't work. And Liana had built her fence for more than just property lines. She'd built it to hold. When the final judgment came, it didn't arrive with drama. There was no gavel slam, no raised voices or theatrical outbursts. It came as a certified letter, quietly delivered to Liana's mailbox by a carrier who now greeted her with a cautious nod. The envelope bore the seal of the county civil court, and the words inside were as precise as they were final. The court found in her favor. The administrative actions taken against her property were ruled invalid. The lien was ordered removed with prejudice, and the actions of the community board, specifically those involving Karen West, were deemed coordinated misuse of authority resulting in material harm. Civic Management Solutions, now under state-level review, was barred from contracting with residential associations pending the outcome of broader regulatory investigations. The victory was not clean or emotionally satisfying. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments of wrongdoing from the people who had spent months trying to break her. Karen never reached out. She simply vanished from public view, her name scrubbed from community records, her social media accounts locked down or deleted, her property sold quietly 6 weeks after her removal. No one said where she went, and Liana didn't ask. She didn't care. Her fight had never been about punishing one person. It had been about severing the pattern that made someone like Karen possible in the first place. In the weeks that followed, Liana resumed life not as it had been before, but as something harder, sharper, more self-possessed. She repaired what could be fixed and fortified what couldn't. The fence remained intact, its steel skeleton untouched since the day it absorbed the impact that started everything. The land had scars, cut patches of grass where utility stakes once stood, filled trenches from inspections, and marks on the gate from the night someone tried to breach it. But they remained as reminders, not as wounds. She didn't sand them down or cover them up. This land had earned its right to show what it survived. So had she. Some neighbors eventually returned to a posture of distant politeness. They nodded as they walked their dogs or paused with hesitant greetings near their mailboxes. Liana responded only when it made sense. She no longer expended energy on pleasing people who had remained silent when it counted. She didn't hold grudges, but she remembered. A few newer residents approached with genuine curiosity, asking for details about the case, seeking advice on how to understand what had happened. Liana was honest, not bitter. She explained the difference between conflict and pressure, between complaints and campaigns. Most listened. Some flinched when she spoke of legal filings and forged inspection requests, but a few took notes. Those were the ones she offered her card to. Professionally, the battle shifted her trajectory. She began consulting, not as a legal advisor, but as someone who had endured what others merely theorized. Real estate lawyers contacted her for private briefings. Community watch groups asked her to speak discreetly about how not to weaponize internal structures. Developers now knew her name, not as an obstacle, but as a variable, one that could no longer be predicted or ignored. Some avoided her entirely. Others, more pragmatic, approached with proposals that carefully tiptoed around the concept of authority. Liana took none of the offers. Her land wasn't for sale. The countersuit moved slowly through its next phase. Depositions were collected, evidence reviewed, expert witnesses lined up. Liana didn't check in daily. She let her legal team do what they were best at while she focused on the life she had rebuilt through resistance. When the time came for testimony, she gave it clearly, without embellishment. Her voice was steady, her answers tight. She didn't rehearse emotion, didn't try to dramatize. The truth didn't need help. It was heavy enough on its own. When asked why she hadn't settled or walked away, she said something that surprised even herself. Because if I had, it wouldn't have ended with me. Someone else would have taken my place. Probably someone less prepared. They would have had no idea what was coming. She hadn't won because she was the strongest. She won because she refused to be hurried out, worn down, or intimidated. She responded to every threat with discipline, to every attack with documentation. And in doing so, she left behind a blueprint, not just for how to fight, but how to endure when the fight becomes systemic. The final confirmation that it was over didn't come from court filings or account statements. It came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, when she stepped outside to trim the edge of her property line and noticed a small sign, newly posted at the entrance to the subdivision. It was clean, formal, newly approved by City Council. Community Regulatory Reform Pilot District, Independent Oversight Active. Her case had triggered a new state-sponsored review model. She hadn't just defended her land. She had shifted policy. And for the first time in months, Liana allowed herself a moment to exhale, not in relief, but in resolve. She hadn't just survived the crash. She had reinforced more than a fence. She had reinforced the boundary between what power could reach and what it could no longer take without a fight.